Life is like a box of VHS tapes. You never know what you're gonna get. That's a bad impression. Anyway, today, it's Forrest Gump on VHS Crazy, so hang on tight.
Hello? Popcorn delivery.
Put a little weekend in your week. Rent a video.
All of you know this movie. Probably 95% of you have seen this movie. If you haven't seen this movie, I don't know. Are you living under a rock or what? This is a film which literally broke box office records. I don't think you could walk into a VHS rental store and not be greeted by a copy of Forrest Gump on the shelves. I wouldn't be surprised if VHS rental stores didn't have like 10 copies of this thing. And this VHS is from 1995. The movie itself came out in 94. So already on the back cover it's saying, Tom Hanks gives an astonishing performance as Forrest in this acclaimed film from director Robert Zemeckis that rocketed to box office history and touched the hearts of filmgoers like no other movie. So already the sales are saying this is a big movie right here, you know. 1 year and the tickets are in, and this is making serious bank at the box office. I'd say the appeal of Forrest Gump lies in the fact that nobody had ever really tried a decade-spanning movie before. I guess that's because before the 90s, people really lacked the property of retrospect. I'd say the 90s were the first decade when Americans legitimately experienced nostalgia. I don't think, which isn't to say nostalgia didn't exist before then. Otherwise, you know, in the 70s you wouldn't have movies like 1941, which are about the 40s. Nostalgia usually harkens back to about 30 years prior. That's how nostalgia works. Man, will I ever stop referencing 1941? But this is the first film to really capitalize on the properties of time and how the decades seamlessly join into one another. And it's also, I'd say, very appealing because it is the first film made which, you know, tries to capture the past and does it in an almost seamless fashion. Like, a lot of movies, you know, during the early 90s, late 80s that are set in the 50s or the 60s or whenever are going to be more 80s or 90s than 60s or 70s or 50s or whatever. But this movie really captures the vibe of the past, and that's why it's so nostalgic. That's why it really that's why it seems so authentic. Like, you know, the props are all period accurate, the scenery is period accurate. They did like tons of research. They really looked into it. And this is the first movie I can say, oh yeah, this does look like before the movie was made. Like Robert Zemeckis knows what he's going for, you know, if that makes sense. That said, I also consider this the transition point in Tom Hanks' career between the funny comedies, Bachelor Party, The Burbs, Joe versus the Volcano, to his nice serious career with Sully and Captain Phillips and Apollo 13. And both halves of his career are equally interesting. I personally like a lot of his early comedies. They're really funny stuff, and some of them are seriously underrated. I don't know how Joe versus the Volcano doesn't have a bigger following. It's only a cult film, but this here is his first serious attempt at, you know, hardcore drama. This is his first, you know, trying to be a serious actor. But you know, this is a movie so wide in scope that you know, it tries to capture the human condition. And that's difficult for a 2-hour movie to pull off, but somehow this 2-hour movie functions as a comedy, a drama, a romance, Like it is pretty much everything. Like it tries to say 50s through the 90s, various regions, various stuff, and it is just it's so wide in scope that to describe the plot is like describing life itself. Thus the quote. I don't think you'll find a more famous collection of quotes in any movie. I mean, the poster is so iconic, just Tom Hanks in front of this white background. It's simple, but it's iconic. In fact, Dumb and Dumber did a parody of this poster. This is crazy. It is one of the biggest movies of the 90s, It is pretty good. Now, the technology they use in these sequences where Forrest meets famous people like, Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon and everything, they use the same technology, from what I've heard, that's used in the Star Trek DS9 episode Trials and Tribulations. And Trials and Tribulations looks really good. I think that's because they don't try to manipulate any quotes. They just superimpose the DS9 actors into the TOS scenery, and the end result is pretty convincing. But Forrest Gump goes a whole nother step. It says, what if we could manipulate Kennedy's mouth so that he says things that he never actually said? And, like the scene where he's on Dick Cavett with John Lennon, that one actually looks kind of convincing. But, given the time, and I'm going to say this, it does look kind of fake, the parts where Kennedy's moving his mouth. It kind of looks like Clutch Cargo. I'm just going to say it.
Congratulations. How did it feel to be an All-American?
Apparently, maybe it was CGI. I don't know, CGI wasn't so developed back then. Kudos to Robert Zemeckis for trying something new, but it just does look kind of fake. But, it is in grainy photo quality, and the bit where Forrest tries to step up to the Little Rock Nine and give her a purse or a book or whatever, that looks convincing because nobody's talking. But like when Kennedy talks, like it just seems like they got the cheapest Kennedy impersonator off like Proto Fiverr or something. And nobody can sound like Kennedy more than Kennedy, but I don't know, it just sounds kind of fake. Same goes for the John Lennon impersonator. The Dick Cavett impersonator is okay. Nixon sounds, but I do appreciate what the movie was trying to do, which is to manipulate photo and video to make people think, holy shit, is Forrest Gump a real person? I mean, I can only imagine what the frickin' moviegoers in 94 were thinking, like, they edited Forrest Gump into this clip of President Johnson where he says he got shot in the ass, and then Forrest asks, would you like to see where I got shot in the ass? And then, the audience member would just be like, yeah, good one, Robert Zemeckis. But then he, shows him his ass, and President Johnson is like, I think that guy just showed me his ass. And, I can only imagine what someone in 94 was like, playing some frickin' mind games here, Robert Zemeckis. I thought Forrest Gump was a fictional character, but he's frickin' talking to President Johnson and showing him his ass? What the frick? So yeah, it was obviously mind-blowing for the time, and I'd also say Forrest Gump, the creation of the Bubba Gump shrimp chain, a restaurant which, 26 years later still exists in some areas, a defictionalized product, all just to make, the movie seem more realistic. That is like some Blair Witch levels of immersion right there. And I think Forrest Gump doesn't get enough credit. You start an entire frickin' shrimp chain just to make this story of this weirdo and his and his shrimp-loving pal in Vietnam seem more realistic, and you keep it open for 26 years? You gotta be kidding me. Then again, there is a Caddyshack restaurant, so I don't know. There just aren't that many themed restaurants here in Denver besides Casa Bonita, so I don't know. Maybe there's, freaking face-off restaurants. Who knows? Yeah, that should definitely be appreciated. Tom Hanks is really good in this. As someone with Asperger's syndrome, I get asked quite a bit why I like Forrest Gump, why I'm okay with Forrest Gump, and why I'm not okay with something like The Big Bang Theory, where they hire non-autistic actors to play autistic people. And that's because I don't think Forrest Gump is supposed to be autistic. I mean, he's not antisocial, per se. He's whatever condition he's supposed to have, it isn't autism, so I can't possibly be offended by this. His portrayal is very realistic, it's very convincing, and I personally think there's nothing wrong with having someone with an unspecified mental condition. That's fine. It's just that Sheldon and his pals on The Big Bang Theory are clearly supposed to be on the spectrum, and you really can't have an accurate portrayal of autism unless you hire someone to play the autistic character who's actually autistic. It's not that hard to do. Like I said, autism is a 1 in 100 condition. 1 in 100 people have it. You can hire an autistic actor. But this isn't a movie about autism, so I don't really care. It's a good movie. It's interesting in that not too many people talk down to Forrest for his whatever his condition's supposed to be. They're not too condescending for it, aside from the bullies in the first scene.
Wrote me a letter, you idiot.
I'd say the Bubba Gump shrimp chain is probably the second defictionalized product after Wonka bars. I think Wonka bars were the first defictionalized product. Actually, for a time, if I remember correctly, there was a Soylent Green bar in some stores. Man, oh man, would I have liked to know what that tasted like. Just imagine Soylent Green sold in your neighborhood supermarket. But
It's people.
the Bubba Gump shrimp chain is a very nice defictionalized product. If you want an example of how to do a defictionalized product right, the Bubba Gump shrimp chain is pretty much where it's at. It's just a very immersive film. The scene transitions are really nice. They're all stitched together so that no matter how much different stuff is going on, you never lose track of it. You always understand that it's this year, and Forrest is whisked through it, and it's quite the journey from beginning to end. This is a movie that really never gets boring. It never loses its drive. It starts at the beginning, it ends, and one benefit I would say to this film is that it's impossible for this film to be dated. A lot of movies from the 90s feel dated because they thought, that they would be appealing in the 2010s and the 2000s. They thought that they would still be relevant, and sadly they're not. But this is a movie that ends in 94 when it's set, when it was filmed, so it's really impossible for this film to be dated. It doesn't continue into the 2000s. We know Forrest has a son, Forrest Jr. We know he's going to have some kind of fun adventures, but we don't know what they are, and we never will. There's never going to be a Forrest Gump Part 2. This is a finite film. This is a film that starts at the beginning, ends at the end. And that's very admirable. This is, I'd say, the least dated film from the 90s because it's set expressly in the 90s and the decades before it. So this is a very smart strategy. It ensures that this film will never be dated. There are some movies that, you can say, oh, this is timeless. This could happen today, but there aren't any cell phones in it, and everyone is still using, everyone's still watching David Letterman. So while there are some 90s movies that could happen today, this is a movie that could only happen in the 90s because it ends in the 90s. Very smart pacing, very smart chronology to this thing. This thing knows what it's trying to do. It does what it sets out to do. I say that a lot about a lot of these movies, but this movie knows what it's doing and it does it really well. There aren't many movies one could compare this movie to. One movie that this could be compared to is Tim Burton's Big Fish, which also deals with a nostalgic journey through the decades. Big Fish starts in the late 40s, early 50s, ends around the 70s. Well, that's the end of the that's the end of the flashback portion. It actually ends around the 2000s, but Big Fish isn't anywhere near as good as Forrest Gump. But Big Fish is good. I think it's an underrated Tim Burton joint. There's
a lot of expectation.
It's okay. It does what it's trying to set out to do, and oddly enough, both of them are set in the South. I don't like the South. I think, it's a yucky region, but Forrest Gump somehow manages to make a compelling, Southern flavored movie. I don't know. I think it's just that, Forrest being the main character is this very sweet, naive, guy, and he doesn't know about racism or anything. So, whichever. He's not, he's just so gosh darn naive. He's just oblivious to everything that happens around him. And that's kind of the charm of it. This isn't a movie that tries to, say, oh man, the South was yucky back in the day, or the South was racist. It's implied, you get it from the scene with the whack jobs driving the Confederate flag truck, but Forrest Gump is very nice, and he gives a book to the Little Rock Nine and whatever when she drops it, and just a very nice character. Forrest Gump, I think part of his appeal is that he's very well developed. You feel like he's been more places than just in this movie. In fact, I'd go so far as to say Forrest Gump is definitely Tom Hanks's most well-developed and intricate performance. Definitely one of the most intricate performances of the past 50 years. Definitely a great character. Like, Robert Zemeckis hit a slam dunk here. And that's because, for the most part, this was a film that tapped into a market that nobody even knew existed, that being the weird nostalgia human condition movie. And things followed, like, The Tree of Life, Waking Life, what's the other one? I don't know. I think it is hard to capture the entirety of human existence in 2 hours, but this is the first movie that attempted such a thing. And would I say it exactly accomplishes that? Nah, it accomplishes, a limited perspective. It's told from Forrest's point of view. Does it accomplish its goal of telling Forrest's entire life and his entire condition and his entire perspective on the world? Yeah, pretty much. After watching 2 hours of this, you'll get Forrest Gump, you'll know who he is, you'll know what his motivation is, you'll know, where he's going, where he's been, what his whole thing is. You'll become intimately familiar with Forrest Gump. But yeah, this is just a classic. There's not much I can say about it that hasn't been said in every review and every essay that's been written on this. I can only imagine the thousands of college kids who make this their thesis project. It's a very interesting movie. There's a lot of symbolism in it. That should be noted. The feather represents Forrest's life, beginning to end, turning up at random events inexplicably, So that's interesting. At least that's what I consider the feather to be. You might have a different interpretation. I don't think there is one. I think the feather is just him drifting through life. But yeah, the feather's great. The last scene is really good. I really like the last scene and how it goes for a little while after the last scene. I don't know, like I said, the pacing is just airtight on this thing. There isn't a single moment of dull stuff in this movie. Maybe there were a lot of cutscenes. I don't think so. I think this is just a very well stitched together movie. I've never heard of any cutscenes in this. I think if there were any, I can't even imagine what they'd be like, because this movie really, every scene is necessary, every line is necessary. From start to finish, this film is chronologically complex and marvelous. And I can definitely see why this was big in 1994. This was the first movie that really capitalized on nostalgia. And in many ways, it's the first film to really take a retrospective on the entire 20th century. Before Forrest Gump, not many people thought about the 70s as this unique decade, and the 60s as this unique decade. And nobody really appreciated the 80s, and no one thought about all that. But once Forrest Gump came out, people were like, oh yeah, the decades are kind of a cool concept, and it is kind of fun to categorize all these aesthetics and motifs into different chunks of 10 years. So yeah, this is just a very interesting film. It didn't even come out around, 2000, but it is the first movie to fully capture the 20th century in all its historic relevance and glory. And I don't know, it's a film that's unlike any other, which could be said for a lot of Tom Hanks movies. I can definitely say Joe versus the Volcano is also a film unlike no other. But I think this wins out by a narrow margin. This is a movie that you should definitely watch if you haven't, and if you have seen it, good for you. You've pretty much seen the human condition in film form. You're gonna have to give this one a 5 stars. It is a classic, it is a good movie, and I'm glad I have this sucker in my VHS collection. Still looks great, still plays well. They really went to great lengths to hype this up back in '94, and it wasn't for naught. This is a pretty solid film right here. Good Robert Zemeckis joint. Tom Hanks is excellent, and Robin Wright's good too. So yeah, just a solid movie. That said, this has been a VHS crazy review of Forrest Gump, one of the finest films of the '90s. And if you'd like to support these reviews, then buy some Nicholas comics and write to Nicholas Kia, 1424 Columbine Street, number 1, Denver, Colorado, 80206. You may have heard I need a new microphone, so if I could sell some Nicholas comics and buy a snazzy new microphone on which I can record audio, that'd be dandy. And I will see you in the next pizzazz. So long.
Wrote me a letter, you idiot.